The winter wind cut through the town square like a knife, carrying with it the smell of snow and desperation. It was February 1838, and the small trading post of New Echota had seen better days. Once a thriving Cherokee capital, it now served as nothing more than a staging ground for the government's cruel plans. On this particular morning, a crowd had gathered around a wooden platform that had been hastily built in the center of the square. Men in wool coats and women clutching their shawls stood in small clusters, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. They had come for the auction, though most tried to pretend they were just passing through, standing on that platform. Was 17-year-old Ayana, as she looked nothing like what these people expected from someone in her position. Her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders, wild and untamed despite the iron shackles that bound her wrists. Her buckskin dress, though torn and dirty from weeks of captivity, still carried the intricate beadwork that marked her as Cherokee nobility, but it was her eyes that made people uncomfortable. Dark as midnight and blazing with a fire that seemed impossible to extinguish, they swept across the crowd with the kind of intensity that made grown men look away. She stood straight and tall, her chin raised in defiance, as if she were the one judging them rather than the other way around. The auctioneer, a nervous man named Patterson, who had drawn the short straw for this particular job, kept wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. He had been warned about this girl. 3 separate times she had escaped from her captors, once disappearing into the mountains for nearly 2 months before they tracked her down again. The stories of her capture had spread quickly through the territory. She fought like a wild cat, one bounty hunter had told anyone who would listen. Took 4 of us to bring her down, and she nearly took my eye out with her fingernails. Another had shown off deep scratch marks on his arms, claiming she had the strength of a mountain lion and twice the cunning. The truth was even more remarkable than the stories. Ayana had been living alone in the Smoky Mountains since her family was taken during the first wave of forced removals 6 months earlier. While other Cherokee had submitted to the soldiers or died trying to resist, she had simply vanished into the wilderness like smoke. For months she had survived on her own, moving through the forest like a ghost. She knew every game trail, every hidden cave, every stream that ran clean enough to drink from. The skills her grandfather had taught her during long summer hunts had kept her alive. When civilization had failed her people, dots she had watched from hidden places as soldiers burned Cherokee villages, as families were loaded onto wagons like cattle, as everything her people had built over generations was destroyed or stolen. The anger inside her had grown with each atrocity she witnessed, feeding the fire that now burned in her eyes. When they finally caught her, it was only because she had made a mistake born of compassion. She had seen a Cherokee child, barely 5 years old, wandering alone and crying near an abandoned homestead. Against her better judgment, she had come out of hiding to help the little boy, only to discover it was a trap. The child was bait, and she had walked right into it. Even then, she had not gone quietly. The bounty hunters who caught her still spoke in hushed tones about the fight she had put up. One of them would walk with a permanent limp, another had lost 2 teeth, and all of them had scars they would carry for the rest of their lives. Now, standing on the auction block, Ayana listened to Patterson's nervous voice as he began the proceedings. He spoke of her as if she were livestock, listing her qualities like she was a horse he was trying to sell. Strong back, good teeth, knows the mountain country better than any Indian tracker. He stammered, his voice cracking slightly. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Many of them had come expecting to see a broken woman, someone who had been properly tamed by her experiences. Instead, they found themselves facing someone who looked like she might leap off the platform at any moment and tear them all apart with her bare hands. "She's been trouble since day 1, Patterson continued, trying to regain his composure. "Doesn't speak a word of English, though we know she understands it. Won't take orders, won't work without being forced, and she's already tried to escape more times than we can count." What Patterson didn't say, because he didn't understand it, was that Ayana's silence was not ignorance but choice. She understood English perfectly, had learned it from missionaries who had visited her village years before. but she refused to speak the language of the people who had destroyed her world. Her silence was protest, her defiance a declaration. That they might chain her body, but they would never chain her spirit. In the crowd, several plantation owners studied her with calculating eyes. They saw her strength, her obvious intelligence, and they imagined the profit they could make if they could break her will. One of them, a man named Henley, who owned 300 acres of cotton fields, was already thinking about the example she would make for his other workers, but there was another man in the crowd who saw something entirely different. Dakota stood near the back, his broad shoulders and weathered face marking him as someone who had seen his share of hardship. At 32, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a Cherokee warrior, though he now wore the simple clothes of a working man. He had come to New Ekata on business, serving as a translator for government officials who needed to communicate with the few Cherokee families still trying to navigate the legal system. It was work that paid well enough to keep him alive, though it left a bitter taste in his mouth every day. Dakota had lost everything in the early days of the removal. His wife, Winona, had died of fever during the brutal journey west. His two young children had succumbed to the same sickness within days of their mother. He had buried them beside a nameless river, marking their graves with stones that would probably be scattered by spring floods. Since then, he had lived like a man walking through a dream. He did what was necessary to survive, but nothing more. The fire that had once burned in his chest had been reduced to barely glowing embers. He helped his people when he could, but he no longer believed in hope or dreams or the possibility that things might get better. Then he saw Ayana on that platform, and something stirred inside him that he had thought was dead forever. He saw the way she held her, head high despite the chains. He saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the unbroken spirit that radiated from her like heat from a fire. Most of all, he recognized something in her that reminded him of the old stories his grandmother used to tell about Cherokee women warriors who had fought beside their men against impossible odds. As the bidding began, Dakota found himself moving closer to the platform. Henley opened with a substantial offer, clearly intending to end the auction quickly. Two other men joined in, driving the price higher. But Dakota had been saving his money for months, living on almost nothing and taking every job he could find. When he stepped forward and made his bid, the crowd turned to look at him with surprise. Here was an Indian bidding on another Indian, something that made the white men uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite explain. Patterson looked nervous, glancing around as if seeking guidance from someone who wasn't there. "That's a lot of money for one girl," Henley said, his voice carrying a warning that most men would have heeded. Dakota met his gaze steadily. "She's worth it," he replied simply. The bidding continued, with Dakota matching every offer until the other men finally gave up. When Patterson's hammer fell, declaring him the winner, Ayana turned those blazing eyes on him for the first time. What she saw there was not the satisfaction of ownership, but something much more complicated. As Dakota approached the platform to claim her, Ayana did something that shocked everyone present. She spat at his feet with perfect aim, then spoke her first words since being captured, delivering them in Cherokee with a voice like steel. "You are a traitor to your own people," she said, her words carrying the weight of absolute judgment. "You buy and sell Cherokee flesh like the white man. You have forgotten who you are." The crowd buzzed with nervous energy, expecting Dakota to strike her or demand punishment for her disrespect. Instead, he looked up at her with those steady dark eyes and replied in the same language, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across. "The square. I am not your master, sister," he said. "I am your way home." For the first time since her capture, Ayana's expression changed. The blazing defiance remained, but something else flickered behind it, something that might have been hope if she still believed in such things. As Dakota paid Patterson and arranged for her chains to be removed, she studied his face, trying to understand what kind of man would spend his life savings on a stranger and then call her sister. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed that there had been no drama, no breaking of the wild girl's spirit. They would have to find their entertainment elsewhere. But as Dakota led Ayana away from the auction block, both of them carrying the weight of their separate sorrows, Neither realized that this moment would change not just their lives, but the fate of their people. The winter wind continued to blow through New Echota, carrying with it the seeds of a story that would become legend among the Cherokee for generations to come. The journey into the mountains took 3 days, and for most of that time, Ayanna didn't speak a single word. She walked behind Tekota's horse with her head held high, refusing his offers to ride or rest when he thought she looked tired. Her pride was all she had left, and she wore it like armor against the world. Tekota didn't push her to talk. He had learned patience in the hardest way possible, through loss and grief that had taught him when to speak and when to stay quiet. Instead, he watched her carefully, noting how she moved through the forest with the grace of someone who belonged there. She stepped over fallen logs without looking down, avoided patches of loose stone that might cause noise, and always seemed to know which direction they were heading even when the trail twisted through thick trees on the second night. As they camped beside a small stream, Tekota finally broke the silence. "You know these mountains," he said in Cherokee. Not making it a question, Ayanna looked up from where she sat by the fire, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she nodded once, a slight movement that somehow carried more meaning than words. "I lived here for 6 months," she said, her voice rusty from disuse. "After they took my family," Tekota felt something twist in his chest. 6 months alone in the wilderness would have killed most people, especially during winter. But here she was, still strong, still fighting. "Where is your family now?" Her jaw tightened. "Dead or walking the trail west?" "It doesn't matter, they're gone." That night, Tekota lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest and thinking about the girl sleeping across the fire from him. He had bought her freedom without really knowing why, acting on an instinct he didn't fully understand. Now he wondered if he had done the right thing, or if he had simply condemned them both to more suffering. The next morning brought their first real test. As they climbed higher into the mountains, following a trail that seemed to exist only in Tekota's memory, they came to a place where the path split in 3 directions. Tekota pulled his horse to a stop and studied the options, trying to remember which way led to the hidden settlement. Without a word, Ayanna moved past him and started down the middle trail. When he didn't immediately follow, she turned back with impatience written across her face. "That way leads to a dead end after 2 miles, she said, pointing to the trail he had been considering. "This one goes where you want to go." "How do you know where I want to go?" he asked. She gave him a look that suggested he was being deliberately stupid. "You're Cherokee. You're heading into the deep mountains with someone like me. There's only one reason to do that." She paused, studying his face. "The question is whether you're taking me to friends or enemies." Tekota urged his horse forward to follow her down the trail. "I guess you'll find out soon enough." They reached the settlement just as the sun was setting on the 3rd day. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a small logging camp tucked into a valley between 2 ridges. There were rough cabins scattered among the trees, stacks of cut timber, and the tools of the logging trade visible everywhere, but Ayanna's sharp eyes caught details that others might miss. The way the cabins were positioned to give clear sight lines down the valley. The fact that every worker they passed carried themselves like warriors despite their humble clothes. The sound of children speaking Cherokee in whispers before switching to English when adults appeared. "Clever," she admitted as they walked through the camp. "How many?" 43 now, Tekota replied. 44 with you." An older woman emerged from one of the larger cabins, her gray hair braided with beads that marked her as a clan mother. She looked at Ayanna with the kind of eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. "So this is the wild one we've been hearing about," she said in Cherokee, her voice carrying both warmth and authority. "The girl who lived alone in the mountains and made the soldiers afraid to hunt her." Ayanna stiffened. She hadn't realized that stories about her had spread beyond the bounty hunters who had captured her. "Stories grow bigger than the truth," she said carefully. The old woman smiled. "Sometimes, but not always." She turned to Tekota. "Show her to the empty cabin by the stream. Let her rest." Tomorrow we'll see what kind of person she really is. That night, alone in the small cabin for the first time in months, Ayana should have felt relief. Instead, she felt trapped. The walls seemed to press in on her, and the silence felt heavy after so many nights sleeping under the open sky. She lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and fighting the urge to run. She had been free in the mountains, truly free in a way she had never been in the Cherokee towns of her childhood. There had been no one to answer to, no expectations to meet, no one to disappoint. Just her and the wilderness and the simple challenge of staying alive one more day. Now she was surrounded by people again, people who looked at her with curiosity and expectation. They wanted something from her, though she wasn't sure what. The thought made her skin crawl. Just before dawn, she made her decision. Moving quietly, she slipped out of the cabin and headed for the tree line. She knew these mountains better than anyone, and she could disappear into them like mist if she chose. Let Dakota explain to his people why the girl he had bought was gone. She owed him nothing. She made it almost 2 miles before she realized. Someone was following her. Dakota's voice came from behind her, calm and unsurprised. The trail you're on leads to a box canyon. You'll have to turn back or climb some very dangerous rocks. Ayana spun around, angry at being caught but also impressed despite herself. She hadn't heard him following her, which meant he was better at moving through the forest than she had given him credit for. "I'm leaving," she said flatly. "You wasted your money." "Maybe." He stepped closer, and she could see that he looked tired, as if he hadn't slept much either. "But before you go, let me show you something." Against her better judgment, she followed him back toward the settlement, though they took a different path that led to a ridge overlooking the valley. From there, she could see the entire camp spread out below them, and what she saw made her catch her breath. In the early morning light, the settlement had come alive in ways that hadn't been visible the night before. Children were playing traditional Cherokee games in the spaces between cabins. Women were working at looms, weaving patterns that had been passed down for generations. Men were carving flutes and crafting arrows, teaching boys the old skills that the government said were forbidden. "They think they destroyed us," Dakota said quietly. "They think that by scattering our people and burning our towns, they ended the Cherokee Nation, but they were wrong." Ayana watched a group of elders teaching young people to read Cherokee syllabary, the written form of their language that many white officials didn't even know existed. "How long has this been here?" 2 years. We started with just 6 families. People find us or we find them. Survivors who refuse to give up, who still remember who they are." He turned to look at her directly. "People like you." "I'm not like them," she said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "I don't belong anywhere." "You belonged in those mountains for 6 months. You kept yourself alive when trained soldiers couldn't track you down. You know things about survival that could help these people, especially the children." Dakota's voice grew quieter. "And they know things that could help you. Like what? Like how to live with other people again? Like how to trust? Like how to hope for something bigger than just surviving one more day." Ayana was quiet for a long time, watching the life unfold in the valley below. She saw strength there, and purpose, and something she had almost forgotten existed: community. These people had found a way to keep their culture alive in secret, to raise their children with Cherokee values while hiding in plain sight. But she also saw vulnerability. If soldiers found this place, everyone here would be captured or killed. The children would be sent to schools designed to strip away their identity. The elders would die in prison. All of this careful work would be destroyed. "They're not safe here," she said finally. "Nowhere is safe," Dakota replied. "But here, at least, they're free to be Cherokee. That's worth the risk." As they walked back down to the settlement, Ayana found herself noticing things differently. The positioning of the cabins wasn't just for defense. It was also arranged according to traditional Cherokee patterns, with the council house at the center and family groups clustered around it. The logging equipment was real and functional, providing both camouflage and income. But it was also positioned so it could be abandoned quickly if necessary. These people had thought of everything. They had found a way to preserve their culture, while adapting to survive in a hostile world. It was exactly what she had been trying to do alone in the mountains. But they were doing it together, supporting each other instead of fighting the world alone. Maybe, she thought as she watched children run laughing between the cabins. There was something to be said for not facing the world alone after all. That evening, she found Dakota sitting by the stream behind her cabin, working on a piece of wood with careful precision. She sat down beside him without invitation and watched his hands shape what would eventually become a flute. "Why did you really buy me?" she asked. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When 3 months had passed since Ayanna arrived at the hidden settlement, and she had found her place among the Cherokee survivors in ways that surprised everyone, including herself, the restless energy that had made her seem wild to outsiders became focused purpose in this community that understood her. Every morning before dawn, she would slip out of her cabin and move through the forest like a ghost, checking the paths that led to their valley for signs of strangers. She had created an invisible network of warning signals, broken twigs arranged in patterns, stones placed just so, scratches on tree bark that looked natural but carried meaning for those who knew how to read them. The children followed her around like she was some kind of legend come to life. They begged her to teach them how to move silently through the woods, how to read tracks in soft earth, how to find food and water when they had nothing but their knowledge of the land. She was patient with them in a way that surprised the adults, showing them secrets that had kept her alive during those long months alone. "You must think like the deer," she would tell them as they practiced walking without making noise. "The deer knows that one careless step means death. Every movement has purpose." But it was with the older children, the teenagers who remembered life before the removal, that Ayanna found her true calling. These young people carried anger and grief that matched her own. They understood what it meant to lose everything and still be expected to keep living. She taught them to channel that anger into useful skills. How to scout without being seen, how to create hiding places that could shelter whole families, how to read the intentions of strangers from the way they moved and spoke. Most importantly, she taught them that being Cherokee wasn't something that could be taken away by laws or soldiers or schools designed to erase their identity. "They can scatter our people," she told them one evening as they sat around a carefully hidden fire. "They can burn our towns and steal our land, but they cannot touch what lives in here." She tapped her chest over her heart. "That belongs to us forever." Dakota watched her transformation with something that went beyond admiration. The broken, angry girl he had bought at auction was becoming a leader, someone people looked to for guidance and strength. When disputes arose in the settlement, they increasingly brought their problems to her rather than to the traditional elders. When decisions needed to be made about security or survival, her voice carried weight that surprised everyone. It was Ayanna who suggested they create backup hiding places deeper in the mountains. It was her idea to establish contact with other Cherokee communities scattered across the territory. And when a trader brought news that government agents were asking questions in nearby towns, it was Ayanna who organized the drills that would allow the entire settlement to disappear into the wilderness within an hour. "She thinks like a war chief," old Grandmother Willow observed one day as she watched Ayanna teaching a group of women how to pack essential supplies so they could be carried easily. "But she has the heart of a mother bear protecting her cubs." Dakota was away when the crisis came. He had ridden to the territorial capital to meet with a government official who claimed to have news about Cherokee families who had been separated during the removal. It was dangerous work, but someone had to maintain contact with the outside world, and Dakota's ability to move between the Cherokee and white communities made him the logical choice. The danger arrived on a Tuesday morning, in the form of 3 white men on horseback, riding slowly up the valley like they owned it. Ayanna spotted them from her usual watching post on the ridge and felt her blood turn to ice. These weren't lost travelers or harmless traders. Everything about the way they moved screamed trouble. She used the bird call signals she had taught the settlement to spread the alarm, then moved quickly through the forest to get a closer look at the visitors. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. The men were armed, well-dressed, and asking too many questions about the logging operation. And where all the workers were, the leader, a thin man with cold eyes and expensive boots, was particularly interested in the children. "Awful lot of young ones for a logging camp," he commented to the settlement's official leader, an older Cherokee man named Joseph, who served as the public face of their operation. "Families follow the work," Joseph replied carefully, but Ayanna could see the sweat on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Families, yes," the stranger said. "But these children, they look Indian, Cherokee, I'd say." His voice carried a threat that made Ayanna's hands clench into fists. "You know it's illegal to harbor Cherokee refugees. They're supposed to be in the territories out west." Ayanna made her decision in that moment. The settlement had protocols. For this situation, careful plans that called for hiding and hoping the strangers would move on. But she could see that wasn't going to work this time. These men had come looking for Cherokee people, and they weren't going to leave until they found them, moving faster than she ever had before. Ayanna triggered the emergency signals that would start the evacuation. Then she did something that went against every instinct for self-preservation she had developed. She walked straight down the hill and into the settlement, making herself visible to the three strangers. "You looking for someone?" she asked in English. Her first words in that language since the auction months ago. The leader turned to study her, and she saw recognition flicker in his eyes. Well, what do we have here?" He dismounted from his horse and approached her, with the confidence of a man who had never met real resistance. "You're Cherokee, aren't you, girl?" "I'm a lot of things," Ayanna replied, keeping her voice steady even though her heart was pounding. She needed to keep their attention on her, to give the families time to reach the evacuation routes she had spent months preparing. "Are you now?" The man smiled, but it was the kind of smile that belonged on a snake. "You know, there's a reward for information about illegal Cherokee settlements." Quite a generous reward, actually. Behind him, his two companions had started moving toward the cabins where Cherokee families were frantically packing their most precious possessions. Ayanna stepped sideways, keeping herself between the strangers and the evacuation routes. "Seems to me you're the ones who are lost," she said. "This is a logging camp on private land. You got business here, or are you just passing through?" The leader's smile faded. "I think you and I need to have a longer conversation, girl. Maybe somewhere more private." That's when Ayanna did something that shocked everyone present, including herself. Instead of running or fighting or trying to hide, she laughed. Not a nervous giggle or a bitter sound, but a real laugh that carried across the valley like music. "You think I'm afraid of you?" she said, and there was something in her voice that made the man take a step backward. "You think you can ride into my territory and threaten my people, and I'm going to cower like a beaten dog? Your territory?" The man's hand moved toward the gun at his belt. "This isn't Cherokee land anymore, girl. You people signed it away." "Did we?" Ayanna smiled, and it was a smile that would have made wolves nervous. "Funny thing about land. It doesn't much care about papers and signatures. It knows who belongs and who doesn't." What happened next became legend among the Cherokee survivors. Ayanna gave a call that sounded like a mountain cat's hunting cry, and the forest came alive around them. Cherokee voices echoed from the ridges on both sides of the valley, creating the impression of dozens of hidden warriors. The careful evacuation had turned into psychological warfare. The three strangers found themselves surrounded by sounds and shadows, never quite able to see who was making the noise, but absolutely certain they were outnumbered. Their horses began to dance nervously, sensing the tension in the air. "This ain't over," the leader said, backing toward his horse, but his voice had lost its confidence. "You're right," Ayanna replied. "It's not. So let me make something clear. This mountain has eyes and ears in every tree, every rock, every stream. You or anyone like you comes back here, and you won't make it halfway up the valley before we know about it." She stepped closer, and something in her movement reminded the men that they were dealing with someone who had survived alone in these Mountains for months. The Cherokee Nation isn't dead, friend. It just got harder to kill. The strangers left, but Ayanna knew they would be back with more men and better weapons. That night, as the settlement worked frantically to complete their evacuation to the deeper mountain hideouts she had prepared, the Cherokee leaders held an emergency council. "We can't stay here," Joseph said, his voice heavy with defeat. "They know about us now. It's only a matter of time before they return with soldiers. So we move," Ayanna said simply. "We take what matters and we go deeper into the mountains." "We've been preparing for this, and then what?" asked Grandmother Willow. "We can't keep running forever." Ayanna looked around the circle of faces, seeing fear and uncertainty and the bone-deep weariness of people who had already lost too much. But she also saw something else. She saw determination. She saw people who had refused to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. "Then we do what Cherokee people have always done," she said. "We adapt. We survive. We remember who we are and we make sure, The new settlement was hidden so deep in the mountains that even eagles rarely flew overhead. Ayanna had chosen the location herself during her months of solitary wandering, a valley protected by cliffs on 3 sides and accessible only through a narrow pass that could be defended by a handful of people. Here, in this secret place where mist clung to the trees like ancient spirits, the Cherokee survivors had found something they hadn't dared hope for in years: true safety. The old settlement had been a compromise, close enough to the outside world to maintain necessary contacts but always vulnerable to discovery. This place was different. This was fortress and sanctuary combined. It had been 6 months since the evacuation, 6 months of building and planning and learning to live in a place where they could speak Cherokee freely without fear. The children no longer looked over their shoulders when they played traditional games. The elders no longer whispered their stories around carefully hidden fires. For the first time since the removal began, Cherokee people could simply be Cherokee, and at the center of it all was the growing bond between Ayanna and Dakota, a connection that had deepened from partnership into something neither had expected to find again in their lifetime. It started with the small things. The way Dakota would bring her coffee in the morning when she returned from her dawn patrol of the mountain passes, knowing she took it strong and black like her mood before the sun rose. The way Ayanna would save him portions of whatever the hunting parties brought back, understanding that he often forgot to eat when he was focused on the endless planning required to keep their people safe. They worked together with an ease that surprised everyone, including themselves. Where Ayanna saw threats and planned defenses, Dakota saw opportunities and built bridges. Where he moved carefully and diplomatically, she moved with the swift decisiveness of someone who had learned that hesitation could mean death. "You two think with one mind," Grandmother Willow observed one evening as she watched them organize the evening meal distribution, "like 2 halves of the same spirit." The old woman's words carried weight in Cherokee culture, where such connections were seen as gifts from the spirits themselves. But both Ayanna and Dakota were too damaged by loss to trust in gifts, too accustomed to having precious things torn away to believe they deserved happiness. Still, the connection grew stronger with each passing day. When Cherokee messengers arrived from other hidden communities, they increasingly addressed both Ayanna and Dakota as leaders, recognizing what the settlement had already begun to accept. These two had become partners in every sense that mattered. The first real test of their partnership came when runners brought news from 3 different Cherokee groups scattered across the territory. Government agents were increasing their searches, offering larger rewards for information about hidden communities. Several settlements had been discovered and their people forced onto wagons heading west. The net was closing and the scattered Cherokee survivors needed to decide whether to go deeper into hiding or fight back. "We can't keep running," Ayanna said during the council meeting held to discuss the crisis. "Every time we move, we lose something. People, supplies, hope. Eventually there won't be anywhere left to run to." "What are you suggesting?" asked Joseph, who had followed them from the old settlement and still served as an elder advisor. "That we take on the entire United States government?" "I'm suggesting we stop thinking like victims," Ayanna replied. her voice carrying the quiet intensity that had become her trademark. "We're Cherokee. We survived the Ice Age, wars with other tribes, diseases that killed half our people, and years of white expansion. We're still here because we adapt and overcome." Dakota watched her speak and felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced since before his family died. Not just respect or admiration, but something deeper: pride, hope, the beginning of love for someone who embodied everything strong and enduring about their people. "What do you have in mind?" he asked, and everyone in the council turned to look at him. They had learned to pay attention when these two began building on each other's ideas. Ayanna smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had been waiting her whole life for this question. "We stop hiding and start organizing. We create a network that spans the entire Cherokee territory. Communication lines, supply routes, safe houses, and information gathering. We become invisible, but we become powerful." Over the following weeks, the plan took shape through long conversations between Ayanna and Dakota, sometimes lasting deep into the night as they refined details and considered possibilities. They would use the scattered Cherokee communities' greatest weakness, their separation, and turn it into their greatest strength. "Think about it," Ayanna explained to a gathering of representatives from 6 different hidden settlements. "The government expects us to be broken, defeated, easy to catch. But what if we're everywhere and nowhere at the same time? What if information travels between our communities faster than their horses can carry soldiers?" The network they envisioned was ambitious beyond anything the Cherokee had attempted before. Coded messages carried by traders who looked like ordinary mountain folk. Families who ran boarding houses for travelers while secretly helping Cherokee refugees disappear. Children who could slip through forests carrying information that would take government messengers days to deliver. As summer turned to fall, their dream began to become reality. Cherokee communities that had been isolated for months suddenly found themselves connected to a vast, invisible web of mutual support. A family running short on food would find supplies waiting at a predetermined location. A settlement threatened with discovery would receive warning in time to evacuate safely. The success of their network brought Ayanna and Dakota closer together in ways that went beyond their shared work. They had become true partners, two people whose different strengths combined to create something greater than either could achieve alone. The evening that changed everything started like many others. They sat by the fire outside Dakota's cabin, reviewing reports from their network and planning the next day's activities. But as the night grew deeper and the reports were set aside, their conversation turned personal in ways it rarely did. "Never thought I would care about anyone again," Dakota said quietly, his eyes fixed on the flames. "After I lost my family, I thought that part of me had died with them." Ayanna looked at him across the fire, seeing not just the strong leader everyone else saw, but the man who still carried deep scars from losses that would have broken someone with less inner strength. "Maybe it did die," she said. "Maybe what you're feeling now is something new? Is that what happened to you? Something new growing where something old died?" She considered the question seriously, thinking about the angry, isolated girl who had stood on the auction block almost 2 years ago. That person felt like a stranger now, someone she remembered but no longer was. "I used to think my anger was the only thing keeping me alive," she said. "Now I think it was just keeping me from living." Dakota stood and moved around the fire to sit beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "You saved my people," he said. "You saved me." "We saved each other," she corrected, and when he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, tentative, like two people afraid to believe in good things. But when she kissed him back, it was with all the passion and strength that made her who she was, and he responded with a tenderness that spoke of love carefully nurtured despite the harsh world around them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ayanna rested her forehead against his. "The elders will have something to say about this," she said, but she was smiling. "Let them talk," Dakota replied. "Cherokee tradition honors strong partnerships. They'll see what we've built together and understand." 3 days later, Grandmother Willow approached them as they worked on plans for expanding their network into Tennessee territory. "The council has been talking," she said, her weathered face serious, "about you too." Ayanna felt her stomach tighten, wondering if their personal relationship was going to complicate their leadership roles. "And?" The old woman's serious expression cracked into a smile. "We think it's about time someone organized a proper Cherokee wedding ceremony. It's been too long since we had something to celebrate." The wedding took place on a crisp October morning with representatives from 8 different Cherokee communities gathered in the Hidden Valley to witness the union. It was more than just a marriage ceremony. It was a declaration that the Cherokee people were not just surviving, but thriving, that love and hope and tradition could flourish even in the darkest times. As Ayanna and Dakota spoke the ancient vows that bound Cherokee couples together, promising to be partners in all things, to support each other's strengths and guard against each other's weaknesses. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something larger than a wedding. They were seeing the emergence of leaders who could guide their people not just through survival, but toward a future where being Cherokee meant something powerful and proud. 2 people who had found in each other the strength to dream of better days and the courage to make those dreams real. 7 years had passed since that cold February morning when Dakota first saw Ayanna on the auction block, and the world had changed in ways neither of them could have imagined. What had started as a desperate attempt to save one person had grown into something that government officials in Washington were finally forced to acknowledge. The Cherokee Nation had not disappeared. The network Ayanna and Dakota had built now stretched across 5 states, connecting over 200 Cherokee families who had refused to walk the trail west. Hidden schools taught Cherokee children to read and write in their native language, while also preparing them to navigate the white man's world. Secret councils met regularly to preserve ancient traditions and adapt them to new realities. Trade routes moved everything from food and medicine to information and people who needed to disappear quickly. At the center of it all was the mountain stronghold that had become known among the Cherokee as the Heart, a thriving community of nearly 300 people who lived openly as Cherokee while remaining invisible to the outside world. Government agents still searched for them occasionally, but they might as well have been hunting ghosts. The Cherokee had learned to be everywhere and nowhere at once. On this particular morning in early spring, Ayanna stood on the ridge overlooking the Heart and marveled at what they had accomplished. Children played in the morning sun, their laughter echoing off the mountain walls. Women worked at looms and gardens while men crafted tools and taught boys to hunt. Elders sat in circles, passing down stories that had been told for 1,000 years. It looked peaceful, even ordinary. But Ayanna knew better. Every person in that valley had been trained in ways to disappear within minutes if necessary. Every building had hidden rooms and escape routes. Every child could navigate secret paths through the mountains blindfolded. They had learned to live with 1 foot in the modern world and 1 foot in the ancient ways, balancing tradition with the harsh demands of survival. "The delegation from Washington will be here by noon," Dakota said, joining her on the ridge. At 39, he had grown into his role as a leader in ways that surprised even him. The quiet grief that had defined him for so long had been replaced by confident purpose, though he still carried the weight of responsibility with the careful dignity that made people trust him. Ayanna nodded, her hand automatically moving to rest on the slight curve of her belly, where their first child was growing. The pregnancy was still early, but in a community this close-knit, few secrets lasted long. Already the women were knitting baby clothes, and the elders were debating names that would honor both tradition and the new world this child would inherit. "Are you ready for this?" Dakota asked, though they both knew the question was largely rhetorical. They had been preparing for this moment for months. The federal government had finally acknowledged what Cherokee communities across the territory already knew. Ayanna and Dakota had become the unofficial leaders of a significant population of Cherokee people who had never left their ancestral lands. These were not refugees or scattered survivors. These were organized communities with their own systems of government, education, and commerce. More importantly, they had become too visible to ignore. Cherokee traders moved through white settlements with confidence, speaking both languages fluently and conducting business that benefited everyone involved. Cherokee craftsmen were creating goods that white collectors valued highly. Cherokee guides were leading hunting parties and surveying expeditions through mountain country that no one else knew well enough to navigate safely. The network that had been built for survival had evolved into something approaching a shadow nation, complete with its own internal communication systems, dispute resolution councils, and economic structures. Government officials who had once dismissed the Cherokee as a conquered people were now dealing with organized communities that negotiated from positions of strength. "They're coming to offer us a deal," Ayanna said, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. "The question is whether it's a deal we can accept." The negotiations that followed were unlike anything that had happened between Cherokee people and the federal government in decades. Instead of broken treaties and forced removals, this was a conversation between equals, conducted in both English and Cherokee, with full translation provided for both sides. That the government's offer was more generous than anyone had expected. Official recognition of Cherokee communities that had remained in the Eastern Territories. Legal title to specific mountain regions that would be set aside as Cherokee lands. The right to maintain their own schools and teach their own language. Most surprisingly, the right to elect their own representatives to deal with federal authorities. "You understand," said the lead negotiator, a tired-looking man who had clearly not expected to find himself dealing with such organized and articulate Cherokee leaders. "This would be unprecedented. No other Indian nation has been offered this kind of arrangement." Ayanna translated his words for the Cherokee council members who preferred to conduct the negotiation in their native language, then responded in clear English that carried no trace of deference or gratitude. "You understand?" she said, echoing his phrasing with a slight smile. "We have been governing ourselves successfully for 7 years without your permission. We are offering you the chance to make legal what already exists." The back and forth continued for 3 days with both sides carefully working through details that would affect generations of Cherokee people. Land boundaries, water rights, taxation, law enforcement, trade regulations, all the complex details of two governments learning to coexist. Throughout the negotiations, it became clear that the federal representatives had expected to deal with Dakota as the primary Cherokee leader. He was male, older, and fit their assumptions about Indian authority structures. They kept directing their questions to him and waiting for him to make final decisions, but Dakota consistently deferred to Ayanna on matters of policy and treaty language, making it obvious that she was not just his wife but his equal partner in leadership. When the federal negotiators finally asked directly about Cherokee authority structures, his answer surprised them. "Among the Cherokee, wisdom and strength matter more than whether someone is male or female," he explained patiently. "Ayanna has proven both her wisdom and her strength many times over. Our people follow her because she has earned their trust and respect, not because of any title or tradition." On the final day of negotiations, as agreements were being written down in both English and Cherokee syllabary, the lead federal negotiator pulled Dakota aside for a private conversation. That wife of yours," he said, clearly struggling with how to phrase his thoughts diplomatically. "She's quite domitable." Dakota smiled, thinking of the angry young woman who had spat at his feet 7 years ago, and the confident leader, who now spoke for hundreds of Cherokee people with the kind of authority that came from genuine respect rather than fear. "She is," he agreed. "Cherokee women have always been strong. We just gave her the chance to show how strong." The treaties were signed on a warm afternoon in May, with Cherokee people gathered from across the territory to witness the moment. It was not perfect. No treaty ever was. But it was something no one had dared hope for during those dark years of removal and hiding, official recognition, legal protection. The right to exist openly as Cherokee people on Cherokee land. As Ayana signed her name to the document that would govern her people's future. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a girl branded as too wild to be civilized to a leader negotiating with the United States government as an equal. From someone who had trusted no one to someone who had built a network of trust that spanned 5 states. That evening, as the celebration continued around the great fire in the heart of their mountain stronghold, she and Dakota walked together to their favorite spot on the ridge overlooking the valley. The same place where they had stood so many times over the years, planning and dreaming and building something that had seemed impossible. "Do you think they understand what they just agreed to?" Dakota asked, gesturing toward the federal camp, where the government delegation was preparing to leave. Ayana laughed, the same rich sound that had surprised everyone at that first confrontation with government agents years ago. "They think they just made a deal with a handful of mountain communities. They have no idea they just recognized a nation." She was right, of course. What they had built was more than just a network of hidden settlements. It was a new kind of Cherokee nation, one that had learned to exist within the American system, while maintaining its own identity and values. A nation led by people who had been dismissed as too wild, too broken, too scattered to matter. Years later, when Cherokee children learned the stories of their people's survival, they would be told about the warrior who bought a girl at auction and discovered he had found a queen. They would learn about the woman who channeled her wildness into wisdom, who turned her anger into action, who proved that sometimes the people the world tries hardest to break are exactly the ones it needs most. But on this night, as stars appeared overhead and the sounds of celebration drifted up from the valley below,